The chapel was filled with whispers the moment she stepped through the doors. Lady Clara Hastings walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to her late mother, the hem trembling with each careful step. The candlelight flickered against ancient stone walls, but no warmth reached her skin. She felt the stares of 200 guests like cold needles on the back of her neck. They were not kind stares. They were stares of pity, of scandal, of curiosity that bordered on cruelty. Everyone knew why this wedding was happening. A month ago, Clara had been found alone in the garden folly at Lady Pemberton's ball with a man who vanished before the doors opened. Her reputation had shattered in a single evening, and no name but ruin had waited for her until the Duke of Thornfield had stepped forward. He had never spoken to her before that night. He had simply appeared in her father's drawing room the next morning, his face unreadable, and offered his hand in marriage to save her from disgrace. It was an act of cold, distant duty, and now, at the altar, he did not look at her. Lord Gabriel Thornfield stood tall and rigid in his dark blue coat, his gray eyes fixed somewhere beyond the vicar's shoulder. His jaw was set like a man enduring a necessary but deeply unwelcome task. The vicar spoke the sacred words, and Gabriel's responses fell from his lips with mechanical precision, stripped of any tenderness. When the moment came to lift her veil, his fingers were cool and impersonal, barely grazing her cheek. He bent his head and pressed a kiss so brief, so feather-light, that Clara felt it more as a dismissal than a vow. The congregation applauded politely, but the sound was hollow. She was now the Duchess of Thornfield, and she had never felt so invisible in her life. The wedding breakfast passed in a blur of strained smiles and murmured congratulations that felt like condolences. Gabriel stood beside her but rarely spoke, and when he did, it was to the guests, never to her. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, watched Clara with a mixture of relief and poorly concealed disappointment, as if she had hoped for a grander match but accepted this one as the price of avoiding scandal. Clara's own father, Viscount Hastings, drank too much champagne and avoided her eyes, guilt etched deep into the lines of his face. By late afternoon, the carriage arrived to take the newlyweds to Thornfield Hall. Clara climbed inside, her heart a tight knot of apprehension and fragile hope. Perhaps, she thought, away from the crowd, he might soften. Perhaps the coldness was only for public performance. She was wrong. The journey to Thornfield passed in silence. Gabriel sat across from her, reading a letter by the dim carriage light, his expression so closed it could have been carved from marble. She tried to speak, to offer some gentle observation about the countryside, but he answered with a single word, and then returned to his papers. The hope in her chest flickered and dimmed. When they arrived at the vast, beautiful estate, she stepped into the grand entrance hall and felt the weight of its elegance press down on her. Crystal chandeliers glittered above, and the marble floors stretched into shadow, but there was no warmth. The staff greeted her with polite efficiency, and the housekeeper showed her to the Duchess's chambers, a lovely suite of rooms decorated in pale rose and cream. It was breathtaking and utterly empty. Gabriel did not come to her that night, or any night after. The first week she told herself he was busy. The second week she waited for him at breakfast, only to learn he had already ridden out to inspect the tenant farms. The third week she dressed carefully for dinner, wearing a gown of soft lavender that brought out the gold in her hair, and he sat at the far end of the long table, exchanging perhaps 10 sentences with her before excusing himself to his study. The silence was a living thing, growing heavier each day. She walked the gardens alone, learned the names of the servants, and tried to find a place where she belonged. But Thornfield Hall felt like a beautiful cage, and she was a bird he had no interest in hearing sing. The loneliness soaked into her bones until some mornings she could barely find the strength to rise. Then came the evening that broke something inside her. A fortnight after the wedding, Clara was wandering the east corridor, unable to sleep, when she heard voices from behind the library door. It was Gabriel and his steward, Mr. Fletcher. She paused, not meaning to eavesdrop, but her own name caught her ear. Gabriel's voice was low, flat, and utterly devoid of emotion. "The marriage is a chain I must wear for the sake of honor, nothing more." See that the Duchess's expenses are managed, and I am not to be troubled with domestic trivialities. A chain. She stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle the sound of her own breaking heart. The steward murmured an acknowledgment, and Clara fled silently back to her rooms, tears streaming down her face before she reached the door. That night she understood the truth. She was not a wife. She was an obligation, a burden he had accepted to silence a scandal, and he would never, ever love her. In the days that followed, Clara stopped hopping. She moved through the house like a ghost, quiet and unobtrusive. She no longer waited for him at meals. She no longer dressed with care in hopes of a kind glance. The soft lavender gown was folded away. In its place she wore simple muslin dresses, practical and unadorned. Something inside her had shifted. The pain did not vanish, but it settled into a cold, quiet resolve. She would not spend her life weeping in empty rooms. If she was to be unwanted, then she would find a purpose beyond his notice. She began by visiting the tenant cottages on the estate, a thing no duchess had done in years. At first, the families were wary, but Clara's gentle nature and genuine interest slowly opened doors. She brought baskets of food, read to children, and listened to the worries of farmers and their wives. For the first time since her wedding, she felt a faint glimmer of something like purpose. It was during one of these visits that she met Dr. Matthew Harlow. He was young, with kind brown eyes and a calm, steady presence that put people instantly at ease. He had come to Thornfield Village 2 years before, dedicating himself to the health of the poor with a quiet devotion that reminded Clara of her own late mother's charitable heart. They fell into easy conversation that first afternoon over a sick child's bedside, and a friendship kindled, modest and unassuming. Matthew never looked at her with pity. He saw her not as a scandalous bride or a neglected duchess, but simply as a woman with a good mind and a willing heart. His respect was a balm on wounds she had stopped acknowledging. She began to accompany him on his rounds, learning simple remedies and helping where she could. Slowly, the village embraced her, and for a few hours each day, Clara forgot the cold mansion waiting on the hill. Gabriel noticed the change before he understood it. At first, it was only an absence he couldn't name. He would return from his study in the evenings and find the drawing room empty where she used to sit with a book, hoping he might join her. Breakfast passed without her, a servant explaining that the Duchess had already gone into the village. The house felt strangely hollow, though it took him weeks to admit that the hollowness was her absence. One afternoon, he looked out the library window and saw her walking up the long drive, her hair a little wind-blown, her cheeks flushed with color. She was laughing at something the young doctor beside her had said. The sound floated up, light and free, a sound Gabriel had never heard from her. A sharp, unfamiliar sensation twisted in his chest. He told himself it was irritation at her familiarity with a village physician. He refused to name it jealousy. But the seed had been planted. He began to watch her with new eyes, though he did so from a careful distance. He noticed the way she paused to speak gently to the shyest housemaid, the way the tenants' children ran to her when she approached, the quiet grace with which she now moved through the estate. She was no longer the pale, trembling girl who had stood beside him at the altar. She had become a woman with a light of her own, and that light did not shine for him. The knowledge unsettled him more than he wanted to confess, even to himself. One evening, he entered the morning room unexpectedly and found her writing letters at a small desk. She looked up, and there was no flash of hope in her eyes, no eager welcome, just polite acknowledgement. "Good evening, Your Grace." She used his title like a stranger would. He had been Your Grace to her for months now, but suddenly the formality felt like a door closing. He murmured a greeting and retreated, but her calm indifference followed him all night. The turning point came during the village harvest fair. Gabriel attended out of duty, making a brief appearance among the tenants, when he spotted Clara at the edge of the green. She was helping at a stall selling preserves to raise funds for a small parish school she had championed. Beside her, Dr. Harlow was arranging jars, his head bent close to hers as they shared some private amusement. Gabriel watched as the doctor's hand brushed Clara's arm lightly, an unthinking, familiar gesture. She smiled up at him, open and unguarded, A hot, possessive fury surged through Gabriel, so powerful his vision narrowed. He crossed the green without conscious decision, his presence cutting through the crowd. "Duchess." His voice was clipped, sharper than he intended. Clara turned, and the smile faded into that careful blankness he was beginning to hate. "Yes, Your Grace. I require your presence at the hall. There are matters to discuss." It was a lie, and she likely knew it, but she excused herself from Matthew with a quiet word and walked beside Gabriel back to the carriage. Neither spoke. Inside the carriage, the silence was heavier than ever, but this time it was laced with unspoken things. He stared at her profile, at the serene set of her mouth, and felt words crowding his throat that he could not force out. He wanted to demand why she gave her warmth so freely to a country doctor and not to him, but he had no right. He had built the wall between them brick by cold brick, and now he was trapped behind it. Weeks passed, and Clara's distance grew into a quiet, dignified independence that terrified Gabriel more than any tears or accusations could have. She no longer avoided him. She simply treated him with the kind courtesy a housekeeper might offer a guest. She inquired about his comfort, managed the household with flawless efficiency, and then returned to her own world, a world of village children, charity work, and the steadfast companionship of Matthew Harlow. Gabriel found himself inventing reasons to seek her out, and each time he was met with that same gentle, remote smile that told him he had become incidental to her life. Regret began to gnaw at him, slow and relentless. He remembered the early days of their marriage, how she had tried so hard, how her eyes had searched his face for any glimmer of warmth. He had given her nothing but stone, and now she was stone to him, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. He had starved her of love until she learned to live without it. The realization hollowed him out. Then Lady Celia Montford returned to the neighborhood, and the fragile, unspoken tension between Gabriel and Clara fractured further. Celia was beautiful, poised, and the daughter of an earl. Before the scandal, there had been quiet speculation that she and Gabriel would make a match. Clara had heard the whispers among the staff and had braced herself for the arrival of a woman who was everything she was not, chosen, cherished, untainted by disgrace. When Celia appeared at a dinner party at a neighboring estate, her manner toward Gabriel was familiar, her hand resting on his sleeve with the ease of old intimacy. Clara watched them across the room, and something inside her that she had carefully rebuilt crumbled a little. She made her excuses early and left, the cool night air doing nothing to soothe the ache in her chest. She had believed she had accepted her situation, but seeing another woman claim his attention, seeing the possibility of what could have been, cut deeper than she expected. Gabriel saw her leave. He saw the flicker of pain she tried so hard to hide, and it struck him like a physical blow. In that instant, he understood with perfect, devastating clarity that he loved her. Not the duty-bound obligation of months past, but the woman she had become, the woman she had always been beneath the fear and the hurt. He loved her quiet strength, her compassion, the way she had turned her own suffering into kindness for others. And he had thrown it all away before he even recognized it was his. He disentangled himself from Celia's conversation with a curtness that bordered on rudeness and spent the rest of the evening in a torment of his own making. When he returned to Thornfield Hall, Clara's chambers were dark, and he stood in the corridor outside her door like a supplicant who had forgotten how to pray. The fear of losing her became a constant, cold presence in his chest. He started to leave small gestures, things he hoped she might notice. A rare volume of poetry he remembered her mentioning, left on her sitting room table. A greenhouse built for her to tend winter blooms, because he had once overheard her speak of her love for roses. He arranged for a new roof on the village school without being asked. Clara accepted these gifts with polite gratitude, but they did not bridge the distance. She no longer trusted the language of his offerings, and he could not blame her. He had spoken fluently in neglect. Why should she believe a few late words? One afternoon he found her in the garden, kneeling in the soil among newly planted rose bushes, her hands dirty and her hair escaping its pins. She looked up, and for one unguarded second he saw exhaustion and something sad in her eyes. He knelt beside her, heedless of his fine clothes, and said quietly, "Clara, please." Tell me what I can do." She looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head gently. "There is nothing, Your Grace. You have already done enough." The words were not harsh, but they were final. He stayed there, kneeling in the dirt, long after she had risen and walked away. The crisis came on a stormy October night. Clara had insisted on visiting a sick child at a remote tenant farm despite the threatening weather. Dr. Harlow had gone to a neighboring parish and was not expected back until morning, so she had gone alone with only a young groom for escort. The storm broke while she was still inside the cottage, wild wind and lashing rain that turned the lanes into rivers of mud. Gabriel, returning from business in the county, learned of her absence and felt a terror unlike anything he had ever known. He did not wait for reason or a carriage. He saddled his strongest horse and rode into the gale, the rain blinding him, the thunder drowning out the sound of his horse's hooves. All he could think was her name, over and over, a desperate prayer. He found her on the road, the carriage stranded in a flooded ditch, the groom struggling to calm the frightened horse. Clara was inside, shivering and pale but unharmed, her cloak soaked through. When she saw Gabriel's face through the rain-streaked window, something in her expression shifted: surprise, disbelief, and a glimmer of an emotion she had locked away. He pulled her from the carriage and wrapped her in his own greatcoat, shouting over the storm, "I thought I lost you." His hands were shaking, and it was not from the cold. He lifted her onto his horse and rode back to Thornfield with her held tightly against his chest, his heart pounding so hard he was certain she could feel it. By the time they reached the hall, Clara was feverish, her body giving way to the chill she had fought off for hours. The staff rushed to warm her, and the local doctor, Matthew Harlow, who had returned early, was summoned. But Gabriel refused to leave her bedside. He sat through the night, holding her hand, watching her flushed face and listening to her labored breathing. Matthew tended to her with quiet competence, and though Gabriel felt a twist of jealousy seeing another man care for her, he was humbled by the doctor's skill and gentle manner. In the small hours when Clara briefly surfaced from her fever dreams, she looked at Gabriel with unguarded eyes and whispered, "Why are you here?" Her voice was barely a thread. He brought her hand to his lips, a gesture he had never offered before, and said, "Because I cannot be anywhere else. Not anymore." She drifted back into sleep, and Gabriel remained, the dam inside him finally breaking. In the gray light before dawn, he began to speak, not knowing if she could hear him but unable to keep the words caged any longer. "I have loved you for longer than you know," he said, his voice raw. "Before the scandal, I saw you at the Ashbourne garden party. You were laughing and the sun caught your hair, and I thought I had never seen anything so lovely. I wanted to approach you, but I was a fool, too proud, too cautious. And when the scandal came, I told myself I was acting from duty alone, but it was a lie. I wanted you. I have wanted you from the very first. I was just too much a coward to admit it and too cold to show it. I made you believe you were a burden. You were never a burden. You have been my only light in years of gray, and I have done everything to extinguish it." His voice broke and he pressed his forehead to her hand. Then he continued, quieter, "The man who ruined you, the one who fled the garden, I found him. It took me months, but I found Sir Reginald Harlow in France. He confessed everything in writing. Your name is cleared, Clara. I have the document in my study waiting to show you. I wanted to give you your freedom, even if it meant losing you. I thought, if she stays, I want it to be because she chooses to, not because she is trapped." He fell silent, tears sliding down his face, a duke weeping in the dawn like a broken man. Clara's fingers stirred in his grasp. She had been drifting in and out of fever, but those last words had reached her. Her eyelids fluttered open and she focused on his face with effort. "You found him," she breathed. "You did that for me?" Gabriel nodded, unable to speak. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye. "I thought you regretted me. I thought I was only a chain." He flinched as if she had struck him. "I know what I said. I overheard myself that night in the library. I will never forgive myself for it. I was lying to my steward, to myself. I was terrified of what I felt, so I buried it in cruelty. Please, Clara, believe me now, I love you. I love you so much that the thought of you marrying me against your will, the thought of you trapped, has haunted me. I wanted to set you free so you could choose. Choose me or choose your own path. I will accept whatever you decide. But I could not let you go another day without knowing the truth. The room was quiet save for the crackle of the fire. Matthew Harlow, standing near the door, had heard enough to understand that his presence was no longer needed. He slipped out silently, a quiet smile on his lips. Clara gazed at Gabriel for a long moment, seeing him clearly for the first time, not the cold, distant stranger, but a man who had been as trapped as she, locked in his own pride and fear. She reached up with a trembling hand and touched his cheek. "I stopped hopping," she whispered. "I stopped hopping and it nearly destroyed me. Don't make me stop again." He turned his head to press a kiss into her palm, a promise. "Never again. I will spend the rest of my life giving you reasons to hope." Her recovery was slow but steady, and Gabriel was by her side through every moment. He brought her tea, read to her, and finally, when she was strong enough, showed her the signed confession that cleared her name. They sent copies to the scandal sheets in her father's house. The whispers that had followed her for so long finally fell silent. As autumn gave way to a gentle winter, Clara and Gabriel began to rebuild. It was not a sudden transformation into perfect happiness. There were still awkward silences, moments of old hurt rising unexpectedly, and the slow, careful work of learning each other's hearts. But every day the distance shrank. They walked the frozen gardens together, his arm tucked securely around hers. They dined at opposite ends of the table no longer, but sat close, their hands brushing as they shared quiet conversation. The staff noticed the change and smiled behind their hands. Thornfield Hall, once so cold, began to feel like a home. On a soft spring morning, nearly a year after the storm, Clara stood in the rose garden she had planted with her own hands. The blooms were just beginning to unfurl, delicate pinks and creamy whites, their fragrance sweetening the air. Gabriel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. She leaned back into him, perfectly at peace. A small, leather-bound journal was pressed into her hand, and she looked down to see his handwriting on the first page, a single line. "I loved you too late, but I will love you well for all the days to come." She turned in his arms, her eyes glistening, and kissed him softly. In that kiss was forgiveness, healing, and a promise that had finally, truly been kept. In the village, Matthew Harlow continued his good work, and he was often seen at the hall, not as a rival, but as a respected friend. Clara's school flourished, and Gabriel became a quiet benefactor, never seeking credit. The tenants spoke of a golden time at Thornfield, where the Duke and Duchess walked together among the fields, and where laughter was heard more often than orders. And in the evenings, when the candles were lit and the house grew still, Gabriel would take Clara's hand and lead her to the library, the very room where she had once overheard his coldest words. There, they would sit by the fire, and he would read to her from the poetry she loved, his voice now warm, his heart open. She had stopped hopping once, but hope had returned, stronger and more beautiful than before, rooted not in illusions but in the hard-won, tender truth of a love that had been lost and found again. The pain had been deep, but the healing was deeper still, and in the quiet strength of their union, two broken people became whole.